I'm 26 years old, and the moment my sister called me a loser at dinner while my dad sat there nodding in agreement, something inside me didn't break it, calcified into something sharp, something unrecognizable, something that would eventually cut through every assumption they'd ever made about who I was and what I was capable of becoming. Was actually the sound of me deciding that words were over, and that proof was the only language worth speaking anymore. Stay until the end, because what I built in the shadows over the next 8 months made them question everything they thought they knew about me, about family loyalty, about who gets to define your worth when the people who are supposed to love you use you as a punchline instead. Or you're watching from in front of Dad. What I did next shocked the entire family. And trust me when I say this story isn't about getting even, it's about getting free. This isn't one of those stories where I'm going to sugarcoat the pain or pretend family wounds don't leave the deepest scars, because they do, and mine were inflicted publicly, deliberately, with witnesses who laughed instead of defending me. The dinner table was supposed to be sacred ground where we gathered as a family, but that night it became a courtroom where I was sentenced without trial, condemned by blood relation, and validated by paternal silence that felt louder than any insult my sister could have delivered. I became the architect of my transformation, but because they fundamentally underestimated what shame can build when it has nowhere else to go except inward, where it either destroys you or forges you into something they never saw coming. Hit that subscribe button and drop a like. You're going to want to see how this unfolds. And I promise the ending is worth every painful detail I'm about to share with you. For the first time in my adult life, I stopped performing the role of the grateful daughter who absorbed criticism with a smile and internalized failure as identity, because sitting there watching my father laugh at my expense taught me something fundamental about love and loyalty. Real family doesn't tear you down in public for entertainment. Real support doesn't come with conditions and comparison. And real pride isn't something you have to beg for by diminishing yourself to make someone else shine brighter. Mounded by extended family and my dad's colleagues who witnessed my sister reduce me to a joke while he co-signed her cruelty with his laughter, I made a decision so quiet it was almost spiritual. I would become undeniable, not for their approval anymore, but to prove to myself that their verdict about my worth was complete fiction written by people who never bothered to read past the first chapter of who I actually was. Mali Lash Banamik. Because this story doesn't start at that dinner, it starts 26 years earlier when I was born as the second daughter to Richard Harrison, a successful corporate attorney who believed excellence was the bare minimum and mediocrity was a moral failing, Victoria, and had somehow mastered the art of doing the absolute minimum while receiving maximum praise, a talent I never quite figured out but watched her perfect throughout our entire childhood. My father treated his daughters like a corporate portfolio. Victoria was the blue-chip stock that required no maintenance and always performed adequately, while I was the higher-risk investment he constantly monitored for signs of failure. And let me tell you, when you grow up as someone's project instead of their child, you learn to measure your worth in metrics that were never designed for human beings. Or she had been the daughter who tried too hard at everything, the one whose accomplishments were footnotes in conversations dominated by my sister's mediocre, milestones celebrated like Nobel Prize, announcements worthy of champagne and Facebook posts my father personally curated with pride. These the certificates, awards from my marketing firm was met with polite disinterest and immediate subject changes, while Victoria's participation trophies from corporate events earned standing ovations and multi-paragraph tributes about her natural grace and effortless success that somehow never required actual effort or measurable results. I became a professional at swallowing disappointment, at convincing myself that parental love wasn't supposed to be equal or fair, that some daughters are just born to be supporting characters in someone else's highlight reel while their own victories happen off-screen, where nobody's watching. However, is something people don't talk about enough. Obvious that leaves obvious scars, it's death by 1,000 small dismissals. Tiny moments where you're overlooked, undermined, or straight up ignored while someone less deserving gets celebrated for breathing. But I genuinely wasn't as valuable as Victoria, that perhaps my father's cold assessment of my worth was accurate and I needed to accept my role as the backup child, the plan B daughter, the one who existed to make my sister look better by comparison. Internalized inadequacy. Every time I was dismissed, any accomplishments were minimized. Every time I watched my father beam at Victoria for achievements I'd surpassed years earlier without receiving even a fraction of his pride or attention. The pattern of favoritism wasn't subtle or accidental, it was systematic, woven into the fabric of our family dynamic so thoroughly that questioning it felt like questioning gravity itself. Like maybe this was just how families worked and I was the problem for expecting different. Every family gathering became a performance where Victoria played the lead role and I was cast as the stagehand, invisible unless something needed fixing, or acknowledged as equally worthy of attention or praise. Mornings meant watching my father's face light up at Victoria's mediocre gifts while mine carefully chosen, thoughtfully wrapped, Expensive received a distracted thanks before he returned his attention to whatever story she was telling about her unremarkable week at her marketing coordinator job that paid half what I made as a senior strategist at a competing firm. The comparisons weren't always spoken aloud, but silence communicates just as effectively as words. When your accomplishments are met with subject changes and your sister's participation in basic, adulting gets celebrated like revolutionary achievement. Losing money at 23 using money I'd saved from working 2 jobs through college. My father's response was asking if I'd consulted Victoria about the neighborhood since she has better instincts about these things, as if my master's degree in urban planning somehow made me less qualified to choose where I lived than my sister who still rented a studio their parents subsidized. When Victoria finally bought a condo at 26, using money our parents gifted her as a down payment, gave a toast about her financial maturity, photos on social media celebrating her milestone without a single mention that I'd achieved the same thing 3 years earlier, without anyone's financial help or public recognition. Before I go any further, make sure you're subscribed and drop a like because what happens next gets so much worse before it gets better. And trust me, you'll want to see how I turned this toxic dynamic completely on its head. The psychological damage of being the less favored child isn't something you can easily explain to people from functional families, because it sounds dramatic when you say my parents preferred my sister, but the reality is so much more insidious than simple preference, or invalid when you express hurt. It's watching your achievements get minimized while your siblings' failures get reframed as learning experiences worthy of patience and support you were never offered. It's realizing that no matter how hard you accomplish, you'll never be enough because the measuring stick was designed for someone else's dimensions, and you're being judged by metrics you were never meant to meet. After a particularly brutal, I spent 2 hours showing guests Victoria's vacation photos while I sat there having just won a national award for a campaign I'd led. An achievement he'd acknowledged with exactly 4 words, "That's nice, congratulations," before returning his attention to commentary about Victoria's beach resort aesthetics and her natural eye for beauty. The dinner that destroyed whatever remained of my tolerance for being invisible was supposed to be a celebration of my father's promotion to senior partner at his law firm, a milestone he'd worked toward for 15 years and genuinely deserved recognition for achieving. Marcel had planned an elaborate dinner at Marcello's, this expensive Italian restaurant downtown where reservations required 3 months. Notice and connections my father had cultivated specifically for occasions he deemed important, enough to warrant the venue's prestige. The guest list included extended family, my Aunt Margaret and Uncle David, 2 cousins I barely knew, plus 3 of my father's colleagues from the firm and their spouses. People whose opinions he valued more than gold and whose approval he sought with an intensity that bordered on pathological, making them the worst possible audience for what was about to happen to me. Wearing a dress that cost more than my monthly car payment, I knew our mother had funded because my sister's salary barely covered her rent and avocado toast habit, but she made an entrance like she'd earned every thread of that designer fabric through personal achievement. Formally for the first hour speeches praising my father, congratulations exchanged, wine flowing freely while I sat there nursing my water and participating in conversations that never quite included me directly, always addressed to the table generally, or to Victoria specifically when topics shifted to anything remotely personal. My father asked Victoria about her recent project at work, and she launched into this elaborate story about landing a client that, and I knew this because we worked in the same industry, was actually a standard account reassignment that required 0 effort on her part. But she told it like she'd personally negotiated a merger while I sat there biting my tongue so hard I tasted blood. My father beamed at her with pride so genuine it physically hurt to witness, praising her initiative and natural talent for relationship building. Compliments I'd never heard directed at me despite leading teams and winning actual competitive pitches that generated millions in revenue for my firm. Then Victoria turned to me with this smile, but felt like a knife, and she said, "I remember the exact words because they're burned into my brain like a brand. At least someone in this family knows how to succeed without trying so desperately hard. Haven't you noticed? Like she works so hard at everything and still ends up just a loser compared to people with actual natural talent." Long enough for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for someone to intervene, long enough for my father to defend me or my mother to redirect the conversation, long enough for literally anyone to acknowledge that what she'd just said was cruel and unacceptable. But instead, my father laughed on, a nervous, uncomfortable laugh, but a genuine amused chuckle and said, "Victoria has a point. Others have to compensate," and suddenly every person at that table felt permission to join the laughter at my expense. While I sat there with my fork suspended in air watching my worth get auctioned off for entertainment, value and cheap social bonding over my humiliation. I didn't storm out of that restaurant or throw my wine glass at Victoria's smug face or deliver some dramatic monologue about betrayal and family dysfunction. I stayed through dessert wearing a smile that felt like a mask made of glass cutting into my face with every forced expression. My hands were shaking so badly I had to keep them folded in my lap, knuckles white from the pressure of maintaining composure while something fundamental rewired itself inside my chest, something that felt less like heartbreak and more like the systematic shutdown of every emotional circuit that still connected me to the people. While they laughed and clinked glasses, celebrating my father's achievement with the same enthusiasm they'd just used to humiliate, I made a decision so quiet it was almost spiritual, so definitive it felt like a door closing on an entire version of myself I'd been performing for 26 years. I would become undeniable, but not for them, never for them again. Only for myself and the person I knew I was capable of becoming without their permission or validation. 43 minutes of my life, gripping the steering wheel while tears I'd held back for 3 hours finally fell, blurring the highway lights into streaks of color that matched the chaos happening behind my eyes. Moment Victoria's calculated cruelty delivered with a smile, my father's laugh of agreement, my mother's silence that somehow hurt worse than either of their active participation in my degradation, because at least they were being honest about their contempt while she just sat there pretending not to notice, her daughter being eviscerated for entertainment. But somewhere between exit 32 and my apartment building, something shifted from grief to something colder, sharper, more focused, but calcified and destructive, but calcified into something resembling determination with the kind of anger that doesn't explode outward but turns inward and starts building something they would never see coming until it was too late to dismiss or diminish or explain away with their usual tactics. That night, I stopped being their daughter in any meaningful emotional sense and started being my own project. My own investment, progress that would require exactly zero input or approval from people who'd proven they couldn't recognize value when it sat across from them at dinner, asking for basic human dignity. Unfollowed Victoria on every social media platform, not dramatically but practically because I needed to stop consuming evidence of her being celebrated while I was dismissed, stop the constant comparison loop that had been destroying my mental health since childhood. The next morning, I woke up with swollen eyes and a clarity I'd never experienced before. I would achieve something so undeniable that when they finally found out, the knowledge of what they'd missed, what they'd underestimated, would become its own form of justice without me having to explain or defend or justify anything about my worth ever again to people who'd already decided I was worthless. For 6 months, I lived a double life that would have exhausted anyone without the fuel of spite and determination running through their veins. Like rocket propellant showing up to mandatory family events with the same pleasant mediocrity they expected, while building something extraordinary in hours they knew nothing about and wouldn't have believed possible if I'd told them. I'd been working on a side project for my marketing firm, a comprehensive rebranding strategy for a struggling tech startup that everyone at my company considered a lost cause. But I saw potential everyone else missed because being underestimated teaches you to recognize value in overlooked places. Over into this project early mornings before work, lunch breaks spent sketching campaigns instead of scrolling social media, late nights that turned into all-nighters, fueled by cold brew and the memory of my sister calling me a loser while my father nodded in agreement, like she'd made a brilliant observation instead of committed an act of casual cruelty. Her victories at the dinner table and started executing them in complete silence, because I'd learned the hard way that people who don't believe in you don't deserve previews of your success. They earn either the final product or nothing at all. No in between. No opportunities to sabotage or diminish or plant seeds of doubt during vulnerable development stages. Maid became fuel for another late night working, boasted about her mediocre achievements and received dozens of congratulatory comments from family who never acknowledged mine, became another brick in the foundation of what I was constructing away from their gaze and judgment. As their chief marketing officer, with a salary that tripled what I was making, I accepted without telling a single family member, because this victory needed to be mine alone before it became public knowledge. They could try to minimize or claim partial credit for through genetic contribution or vague, "We always knew you had potential" revisionist history, but you're loving this transformation. Make sure you're subscribed because what comes next is the sweetest part of this entire journey. And drop a like if you've ever worked in silence to prove doubters wrong. You'll understand exactly why I chose to reveal everything the way I did. Required to maintain this double life were significant, but somehow easier than the emotional labor of pretending my family's treatment didn't devastate my gave up most of my social life, stopped dating because I didn't have energy left for romantic vulnerability, became a ghost in my own life who showed up to family dinners with a pleasant smile while haunting the edges of everyone else's expectations and secretly building an empire they couldn't imagine existed. My best friend Lauren was the only person who knew what I was really doing, the only one I trusted with the truth about how badly that dinner had broken something fundamental in my relationship with my family, and how I'd decided to channel that pain into something productive. And honestly, I wasn't always sure of the answers, but I knew I couldn't stop because stopping would mean they were right about me. that I really was just a try-hard loser who worked hard and still came up short compared to people with natural talent, like Victoria, who'd never worked hard at anything in her entitled life. The physical toll of maintaining this double life started showing in ways that concealer couldn't fully mask. Weight loss from skipping meals because eating felt like wasting time I could spend working. A persistent exhaustion that lived in my bones and made even simple tasks feel like climbing mountains in ankle weights. Minutes or work commitments, stealing minutes I needed for building my secret empire. Workspace divided into zones. Responsibilities, another for the startup CMO position. Exceptional in ways, or circumstance or anything except undeniable skill and vision. Life became a concept. I understood theoretically but couldn't participate in practically. Friends stopped inviting me to events after I declined repeatedly. Dates were impossible because I had nothing left to give, emotionally or temporally, to another human being who would require attention and vulnerability I'd allocated entirely to professional achievement. My own life, while haunting the edges of everyone else's expectations while constructing something extraordinary they couldn't see. Showing up to family dinners with my pleasant mask firmly in place, while internally calculating campaign metrics and strategy adjustments I'd implement the moment I got home. My mother would comment occasionally that I looked tired, that I should take better care of myself, or acknowledgement that maybe my exhaustion stemmed from working twice as hard for half the recognition they gave Victoria for showing up and existing attractively. Nights I questioned whether proving them wrong was worth the complete isolation and loneliness of doing it without support or encouragement or anyone except Lauren, knowing what I was sacrificing for this goal. Happiness to prove a point to people who probably wouldn't care anyway. Minimize my success or claim credit or shift focus back to Victoria's mediocrity, celebrated as excellence. But then I'd remember that dinner, remember my father's laugh agreeing I was a loser, remember Victoria's calculated cruelty delivered with a smile, and suddenly the exhaustion transformed into fuel again. The loneliness became armor protecting me from their toxicity, and I'd keep working because stopping would mean they were right about me and I would rather die than give them that satisfaction. I'd designed and executed. I sat alone in my apartment at 2:30 in the morning, staring at the analytics dashboard with tears streaming down my face, not from this overwhelming validation that I'd been right about my capabilities all along, that my family's assessment of my worth was fiction they'd convinced themselves was fact. Mentioning a message at 2:45 congratulating that my vision had transformed a dying company into an industry disruptor, and that conversation led to a formal promotion. Announcement scheduled for the following week, with a salary increase that would put me in the top 5% of earners in my age demographic. Didn't post about it on social media. Didn't even tell Lauren immediately because I needed this victory to be mine, completely before it became public knowledge that could be contaminated by their reactions or attempts to rewrite history about their support, or the filter of their limited imagination and constant Victoria's mediocre baseline. Undeniable success displayed across multiple monitors, understood something fundamental about validation that therapy had tried to teach me but I'd needed to experience directly. Seeking approval from people who'd taught me to doubt myself was a rigged game where the rules changed constantly to ensure I could never win, and the only way to actually win was refusing to play by stopping my participation in their assessment of my worth entirely, untainted by their dismissal or minimization. Proof that when I removed their voices from my decision-making process, I discovered capabilities I never knew existed beneath the weight of their doubt and systematic psychological diminishment. Without my laptop open beside me, calculating metrics, went to bed at a reasonable hour feeling something that resembled peace, mixed with vindication and anticipation for what came next. The first victory was evidence the plan could work, that transformation was possible, that I could build an identity and career so successful that when they finally discovered what I'd accomplished in silence, their shock would be its own form of justice without requiring explanation or defense or any emotional labor on my part. The tech startup wanted to announce my promotion with a press release highlighting how I'd revolutionized their market position through innovative campaign strategy, industry recognition that would make my accomplishments impossible to ignore or diminish, and I scheduled it strategically for 3 weeks before my father's birthday dinner where the same people who'd witnessed my humiliation would be present to witness my vindication. Born purely from spite and determination, to prove my family wrong evolved into something far more meaningful over those transformative months, genuine passion for the work itself, pride in my capabilities independent of anyone's validation, a sense of purpose that existed entirely separate from my need for revenge or recognition from people who'd never believed in me anyway. The tech startup's growth trajectory became exponential after we hit the million-user milestone, and suddenly I wasn't just executing campaigns but leading industry conversations, being invited to speak at marketing conferences, having my strategies analyzed in case studies as examples of how to rescue failing companies through innovative positioning. I realized somewhere between months 6 and 8 that I was no longer doing this to prove them wrong. I was doing it because I'd finally discovered what I was genuinely, undeniably right about. And that shift from external motivation to internal passion made me exponentially more effective at everything I touched professionally. I couldn't have imagined when Victoria called me a loser, and my father laughed in agreement. Expertise in growth marketing, user acquisition strategy, brand positioning that resonated with demographics competitors couldn't reach, analytical frameworks that predicted market movements before they happened. The network I built consisted of other CMOs, venture capitalists who funded promising startups, journalists who covered tech industry success stories, people who knew my name and reputation without knowing anything about my family or their assessment of my worth, external validation, ways that didn't require anyone else's diminishment to feel real or earned, and that anonymity from their perception became my greatest strategic weapon for what came next. Completely to prove doubters wrong. Hit subscribe and drop a like because the reveal is coming and it's absolutely worth the wait. You're going to love what happens when 8 months of secret success meets public family-ification. Hoping my father would text asking how I was doing. Stop scrolling Victoria's Instagram waiting for her to acknowledge my existence with even a token like or comment. Stopped attending family dinners unless they were mandatory events where my absence would create more drama than my presence. I became too genuinely busy building a life they had zero access to or knowledge about to waste energy on relationships that only diminished me. Or my therapist noticed the shift during our weekly sessions, commented that I seemed lighter somehow despite working harder than ever, and I explained that the difference was working towards something I believed in rather than working to earn approval from people fundamentally incapable of providing it. Lauren celebrated every milestone with me privately, became the chosen family should have been but never was, and her genuine pride in my accomplishments without comparison or conditions taught me what healthy support actually looked like when it came from people who loved you for who you were rather than who they needed you to be for their own ego management. Remission where they could minimize my success or reframe the narrative or simply pretend I'd never told them it had to be public. Witnessed by the same people who'd laughed at my expense 8 months earlier. Undeniable in its scope and impossible to dismiss as luck or exaggeration. My strategic patience for the perfect opportunity. And when my mother sent the invitation to my father's 60th birthday dinner, scheduled for the same weekend as my industry award ceremony, I knew the universe had handed me the exact scenario I needed. The birthday celebration would be held at the same restaurant where Victoria had called me a loser, with the same guest list that included extended family and my father's colleagues, people whose opinions he valued more than gold and whose witness to my humiliation had made that night, 8 months ago, so devastating it fundamentally changed who I was and what I believed I deserved from relationships. Marketing promotion to Chief Marketing Officer went live across major business publications, my photograph accompanying articles about how I'd revolutionized a struggling startup's trajectory through innovative strategies that disrupted industry standards. Or my previous firm were messaging me asking if the salary rumors they'd heard were true. And suddenly my professional success was public knowledge that anyone with internet access could verify, independently without relying on my word or trusting that I wasn't exaggerating my accomplishments for effect. Didn't post about it on personal social media where they might see it accidentally. Maintained the same pleasant mediocrity they expected while watching the professional world. I inhabited celebrate achievements they knew nothing about, and wouldn't have believed possible if someone had told them their disappointing daughter had accomplished anything worth celebrating. During those 3 days, practiced keeping my voice steady and emotionless when the moment came. Worked through hypothetical scenarios with Lauren where she played Victoria making dismissive comments, and I practiced responding with facts rather than emotion or defensiveness, or any reaction that would give them ammunition to dismiss my success. Version of myself that could be baited into emotional reactions. What I'd accomplished speak for itself, without embellishment or justification, and to watch their faces when they realized that the daughter they'd written off as a try-hard loser had achieved success that dwarfed anything either of them had accomplished in their entire mediocre careers while they were busy celebrating participation and achievement. Birthday dinner, where he arrived exactly on time wearing a dress I'd purchased specifically for this occasion, elegant but understated. Expensive in a way that didn't scream for attention but whispered confidence to anyone who understood quality when they saw it. The kind of outfit successful people wear when they don't need to prove anything to anyone because their presence speaks for itself. A restaurant looked exactly as I remembered from 8 months earlier. Same tables with white linens, same layout where I'd sat in the corner watching my family humiliate me, while strangers laughed at my expense and decided my worth based on Victoria's cruel assessment and my father's validating laughter. And I had witnessed my humiliation at Margaret, centered in a way I'd never experienced before because I finally had something they couldn't take from me or diminish or explain away as anything, except undeniable proof of capabilities they'd dismissed. Dinner progressed normally for the first 90 minutes with conversations about my father's career achievements, toasts celebrating his milestone birthday, Victoria performing her usual routine of mediocre anecdotes, presented as fascinating stories that everyone pretended to find compelling because disagreeing with the favorite child meant social exile from family approval.
Minimally.
Responding when directly observing the dynamic I'd been trapped in my entire life from this new belief, her tone dripping with false concern that barely masked the cruelty underneath, setting up what she thought would be another opportunity to diminish me publicly, while everyone nodded along because that was the established family script we'd been performing my entire life. Or show emotion, or let years of accumulated rage leak into the moment I'd been building toward for 8 months of silence. Even me, given how badly my hands were shaking under the table, where nobody could see the physical cost of this composure. I explained that I'd recently accepted a position as chief marketing officer at a tech startup that had grown from 30,000 to over 1 million active users based on campaigns I'd designed and executed, that the promotion came with a salary in the top 5% of earners in my demographic, that business publications had covered the story with my photograph, accompanying articles about how I'd revolutionized the company's trajectory through innovative strategies that disrupted industry considered impossible to challenge. The silence that followed my words was so complete I could hear my father's breathing change rhythm, could see Victoria's face cycle through disbelief, to anger, to something that looked remarkably like fear as she realized the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted and she could never call me a loser again without everyone in this room knowing she'd been catastrophically wrong about my worth and capability. Why did my father ask me to repeat what I'd said? Not because he didn't hear the words clearly, but because the information didn't fit the narrative. He'd been telling himself for 26 years about which daughter had value and which one was the disappointment, requiring constant criticism disguised as motivation. His face showed confusion mixed with something I'd never seen directed at me before. Respect, maybe, or at least the recognition that I'd achieved something he couldn't dismiss or minimize without revealing his own failures as a parent, who'd fundamentally misjudged his child's capabilities. The role, the salary, more desperate than the last, as he tried to find some angle to diminish my achievement or reframe it as luck rather than skill. Some way to maintain the comfortable fiction that Victoria was the successful daughter and I was the one who tried too hard and still fell short of mediocrity, celebrated as excellence. Immediately with questions, legibility asking if the company was actually legitimate, or just one of those startups that would fail within a year, suggesting the user growth was probably inflated numbers that didn't reflect real engagement, doing everything possible to rewrite reality in real time, because my success invalidated the entire foundation of her superiority complex, built on being naturally talented while I was just a desperate try hard and still lost. But my Aunt Margaret, who worked in tech investing, interrupted Victoria's interrogation to say she'd actually read about my company in Forbes and TechCrunch, that the growth trajectory was being studied as a case example of successful brand repositioning, that several venture capital firms were fighting to lead their Series B funding round specifically because of the marketing strategy I'd implemented. Validated my success with third-party credible sources she couldn't dismiss or argue with was almost more satisfying than the achievement itself, proof that reality had finally caught up to their fiction and they had to acknowledge what they'd spent years denying. The other dinner guests congratulated me with genuine enthusiasm, asked detailed questions about the campaigns and strategy, treated me like I'd just revealed the superpower I'd been hiding rather than accomplishments I'd been achieving, while my family systematically ignored everything I did that didn't serve their preferred narrative. Laughed at Victoria's loser comment 8 months earlier now looked uncomfortable, perhaps remembering their participation in my humiliation and realizing they'd misjudged someone who'd just been publicly validated as successful by industry standards they understood and respected. Receive the recognition he'd never given me, my achievements than he'd shown in my entire lifetime.
Jested.
Luffs of thing tonight that couldn't be recovered with apologies or a revised history. About how he'd always believed in me despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, spanning 26 years of systematic dismissal and comparison to my mediocre sister he'd celebrated for breathing, while I earned advanced degrees and built careers that dwarfed anything either of them had accomplished. When that moment, watching my father struggle to process information that contradicted everything he'd believed about me for 26 years, I realized something profound that therapy had tried to teach me but I'd needed to experience directly. I didn't need them to apologize or admit they were wrong because their shock was confession enough. Their stunned silence was all the validation I'd spent years desperately seeking from people, fundamentally incapable of providing it honestly. The way my father's colleagues suddenly treated me with respect they'd never shown before. The way Victoria stopped talking entirely and stared at her plate like it contained answers to questions she couldn't articulate. The way even my mother looked at me with something resembling surprise mixed with pride she'd never expressed when one actually needed it. During childhood, all of it confirmed that I'd won not by their acknowledgement but by creating a reality so undeniable they had no choice. This judgment of my worth and capabilities. Watched my father try desperately to take partial credit for my success. Heard him tell his colleague that he'd always encouraged Emma to pursue marketing, despite years of evidence showing he'd never asked about my career except to compare it unfavorably to Victoria's mediocre achievements, that he celebrated with enthusiasm he'd never directed toward my actual accomplishments. Reframe our relationship history, or suggesting to our aunt that she'd been supportive all along and was so proud of me. Revising reality in real time because admitting she'd called me a loser 8 months ago, while everyone laughed, would make her look cruel and petty in front of witnesses who were currently celebrating my success. But I didn't correct them or call out their revisionist history because doing so would make me look petty and bitter when the truth was, I'd already won. I no longer needed their approval to know my worth, no longer required their acknowledgement to feel successful, no longer measured my value by their impossibly biased standards designed to elevate Victoria while diminishing me regardless of actual achievement or merit. Or their validation was more liberating than the professional success itself, because it meant they no longer had power over my self-perception or emotional well-being. They were just people with flawed judgment and limited imagination who'd missed the opportunity to support someone extraordinary because they were too invested in maintaining comfortable fictions about which daughter deserved their pride. Some people will never own their cruelty or acknowledge how deeply they wounded you, will never apologize sincerely or take responsibility for systematic psychological damage they inflicted through years of comparison and dismissal and casual humiliation disguised as family dynamic. But their refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing doesn't change the reality of what happened or invalidate your experience, doesn't erase the scars or minimize the recovery required, and most importantly, doesn't prevent you from building a life so successful that their opinion becomes irrelevant background noise you can finally afford to ignore because you've proven to yourself that their assessment of your worth was always fiction they convinced themselves was fact. The story isn't really about revenge in the traditional sense. It's about what happens when you stop performing for an audience that was never going to applaud your efforts and start building for yourself according to standards you set rather than impossible metrics designed by people who benefited from your perceived failure. You can call it that. Wasn't in humiliating them the way they'd humiliated me, or making them feel small, the way they'd made me feel worthless my entire childhood. It was in becoming so successful that their opinions stopped mattering entirely, in building an identity and career so solid that their dismissal couldn't touch the foundation of self-worth I'd constructed independently of their validation or approval. It wasn't the external success that looked impressive on paper and earned recognition from industry leaders. It was learning that family who diminishes you doesn't deserve front row seats to your evolution. They earn distance and information limitations, or emotional labor, or continued access to your vulnerability they'd already proven they'd weaponize against you. Mama's pride to feel complete as a person, without his acknowledgement of my worth, or somehow fundamentally broken or insufficient or actually deserving of the comparison to Victoria that always left me coming up short. Despite objective evidence showing I'd accomplished more with less support and fewer advantages. But sitting there at that birthday dinner, watching him struggle to reconcile his narrative about the disappointing daughter with evidence of undeniable success, I understood something therapy had been trying to teach me for years. Seeking validation from people who taught you to doubt yourself is a rigged game where the rules change constantly to ensure you can never win. And the only way to actually win is refusing to play by stopping your participation in their assessment of your worth. The game was designed for me to lose, not because I lacked value but because my failure served their psychological needs. Made Victoria look better by comparison, gave my father a project to fix because accepting that I was already successful meant confronting his own failures as a parent who'd systematically favored one child, while destroying the other's self-worth through decades of comparison and casual cruelty. Most important lesson I learned through this entire experience wasn't about career success or proving doubters wrong, or even the satisfaction of watching people who dismissed you realize they were catastrophically mistaken about your capabilities. It was that you cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick, cannot grow while still seeking approval from people invested in your smallness, cannot become your full self while performing a diminished version designed to make others superiority, abandonment or failure or something to feel guilty about. It's self-preservation. It's choosing your mental health over their comfort. It's recognizing that some relationships damage more than they nurture, regardless of biological connections, about family loyalty. Birthday celebration. Once Tom said himself in attempts to reconnect, once he realized I'd achieved something impressive enough to warrant his attention, stopped engaging with Victoria's performance of sisterly pride that materialized only after witnesses she couldn't dismiss or minimize without revealing her own inadequacy and cruelty. After hearing my story, I want you to ask yourself honestly what you would have done in my place. Would you have confronted them immediately at that dinner 8 months ago? Or would you have chosen the path I took, building something undeniable in silence before revealing it publicly in a way that left no room for dismissal or minimization? The truth is, there's no perfect response to family betrayal and systematic psychological diminishment disguised as normal family dynamic. No. Why they were farther recover from being called a loser by your sister while your father laughs in agreement in front of witnesses, whose opinions he values more than your dignity. Immediately, others would have stayed and fought for recognition they deserved, but I chose a third path. I stopped fighting for their approval entirely and started building approval within myself based on objective achievements they couldn't dismiss even when they desperately wanted to maintain their comfortable fiction about which daughter had value. That revealing birthday dinner, was complete honesty that the revenge wasn't in watching their faces when they realized they'd been wrong about me. It was in the freedom I gained when their opinions stopped mattering to my sense of self-worth and identity. Do you believe revenge ever truly brings peace, or does it just feed more anger and perpetuate cycles of hurt that damage everyone involved, including the person seeking justice? In my case, what looked like revenge from the outside was actually liberation on the inside. The process of separating my self-concept from their assessment and building something independent of their validation or approval. For maintaining silence about my achievements for 8 months, specifically to reveal them at the perfect moment for maximum impact and witness verification. Let me know honestly in the comments what you think about my choices and whether you believe I handled this situation correctly or if there was a better path I should have taken given the circumstances and history involved. If someone in your family made you feel invisible, worthless, or inadequate until you became undeniable through achievements they couldn't dismiss or minimize, that represents what you built in the shadows while they were busy underestimating your capabilities and celebrating mediocrity in others. Subscribe for more stories about turning family doubt into personal proof, humiliation into fuel for transformation, and silence into the loudest possible answer to people who never believed you had anything worth saying or achieving. We'll share an even more complex, or sometimes the people who smile at you during meetings are the same ones sabotaging your projects behind closed doors. And what I did when I discovered my mentor was actually my biggest professional enemy, disguised as support. And remember, your worth isn't determined by people who benefit from your smallness. Your value isn't measured by those who need you to stay diminished so they can feel superior. And sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming so successful that their opinion becomes irrelevant background noise you can finally afford to ignore completely.